All right. Peace and greetings, Africans, comrades, and all of those here in interest and solidarity. I'm Evelyn Reynolds, a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Welcome to the 2023 Pan-African Women's International Webinar, hosted by the All African Women's Revolutionary Union, which is a wing of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Pan-African Women's Day is held annually across the world to celebrate the first Pan-African Women's Conference and the creation of the Pan-African Women's Organization in 1962 in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. 1 year prior to the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, women delegations of 14 independent African countries and 10 national liberation movements met at the first conference of African women that took place in Dar es Salaam, Tanganyika, the 31st of July, 1962. The organization that emerged was later called the Pan-African Women's Organization, and the 31st of July was established worldwide as the Day of Women of Pan-African Descent. During today's webinar, we're fortunate to have a beautiful poem and a wonderful panel of Pan-African women that will discuss the struggle to defeat imperialism and patriarchy in their respective parts of the world and within our organizations and communities. Feel free to engage with us in the chat in a respectful and principled way. We would greatly appreciate your constructive contributions to this conversation. So let's get started. Oh, and one more thing, there is, if you have questions as the program is proceeding, just leave those in the Q&A box. All right, so I'm sure that we've all heard the question, what is the role of women in revolution? This is a question that may initially seem harmless and mundane, but when examined more closely, it is apparent that questions like this presuppose that women have a different role in the revolution than men. In 1993, Assata Shakur, speaking to a delegation of the new African Women's Task Force in Cuba, talked about how women in the organizations that she worked with were the most efficient, while also being the most silent, neglected, and powerless. Men were the leaders, and women were literally encouraged to work in the kitchen. They told Assata Shakur that she should work in the kitchen. Another hidden assumption in this question of the role of women in revolution is that women, quote unquote, are a homogeneous group with a standard contribution to the revolution. There is no specific role for women in the revolution. Women are an expansive group of people who offer many things to the revolutionary struggle. The fact of the matter is that there can be no revolution without women. The place for revolutionary women is in the struggle. Although many of our beloved African revolutionary men like Thomas Sankara and Ahmed Sekou Toure have uplifted the plight of women in society and in the struggle, the fight against patriarchy and women reductionism continues today. We cannot have a free Africa with unfree African women. In 2023, the struggle to defeat imperialism is being carried out around the world. What a time to be alive. We understand imperialism to be the full spectrum dominance of countries in the Western Hemisphere, such as the United States, Canada, France, to name a few. Leaders of government in these countries, along with their puppets and compradors in neo-colonial states in Africa and around the world, are tireless in their attempts to politically and economically handicap the development and self-determination of the masses of people in Africa. Imperialism, like all systems of oppression, is also expressed in gendered ways. Globally, women make up the majority of those classified as economically poor. If we glance into the world's garment industry factories, also known as sweatshops, we will find that a vast majority of workers, about 80%, are women. The employment of women in Africa is much lower than that of women in the West, which can be explained by a variety of factors, some structural, some cultural. One of the outcomes of imperialism is that most countries in Africa do not have their own manufacturing processes or the infrastructure required to further industrialize. Instead, they've been forced to develop and extractive economies. As Walter Rodney explained to us in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, these countries are made poor. They're made poor from the leaching of their natural resources for use in other parts of the world, namely the Western Hemisphere. They're also made poor by the debt traps that stem from the World Bank and International Monetary Fund loans. The impact of neocolonialism and imperialism impact women on multiple levels. Under imperialism and patriarchy, African women are triply oppressed on the basis of our nation, on the basis of our class, and on the basis of our genders. We are the slave of the slave. African men oppressed by imperialism, African women in mages oppressed by men under imperialism and patriarchy. We feel the impact of imperialism acutely. We become migrant widows when African boys and men are forced to travel far from their families to find paying work that is often itself dangerous and exploitative. We are forced into unpaid domestic labor to take care of families on our own. At the same time, we are often forced to find paying work that is itself exploitative. Work such as cooks, cleaners, waitresses, sex workers. When the meager wages our brothers send back are so often not enough to sustain our children and ourselves. When our countries are sanctioned, Africa is the most sanctioned land mass on the face of the planet. It is women, mages, children, elders that feel the impact of contracted economies and increasing scarcity of food and medicine most acutely. Foreign military occupation brings instability and violence, including pervasive sexual violence targeting women and girls all over Africa. But exploitation and resistance breed resistance as always, and women and mages are and have always been on the front line of our struggle to end exploitation and end oppression and bring liberation. Examples include women's involvement in the uprisings and mass mobilization against imperialism and foreign military occupation in Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, Congo, Senegal. Women in Azania mobilizing against sexual violence and exploitation is another example. African women in mages in Colombia and mobilizing efforts fighting back against neo-colonialism and neoliberalism. African women in mages in Cuba and collective work that they've done to build the most expansive family code that exists in the world today. Women and marginalized genders need to join and build organizations that we can use to fight collectively for our liberation, to end imperialism, and to build Pan-Africanism, one unified socialist Africa. No one is coming to save us. We have to save ourselves. So viva AAWRU, viva AAPRP, and organize, organize, organize. Thank you. All right, so we are going to move into our panel discussion, which I'm really excited about. And you'll have to put up with me for a little bit longer as I moderate the panel here. And so we're going to start with, I want to give some introductions to our panelists here. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the esteemed panel that we have with us today. So first, I'd like to introduce Sister Moya Missouri Pembele, who organizes as a cadre with the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union in the US chapter of the AAPRP. Moya has worked with the Black August Los Angeles Coalition, the Political Prison Campaign, and the Pan-African Diaspora Union, the 6 regional representing group in the African diaspora preparing to join the African Union. She's also worked with various organizations such as the Eritrean People's Liberation Front and the Pan-African Congress of Azania, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde, and the Amilcar Cabral African Youth Group and the African National Congress. Comrade Missouri has a history and wealth of experience of connecting the African experience in women's liberation through the coordination of local Pan-African women's programs in California, as well as the Revolutionary African Women website and podcast. I want to welcome Sister Moya. Our second panelist is Enemisat Richardson, who's been organizing with the AAPRP. Her work exemplifies someone who is ready for revolution. Informed by the initial work she did with the socialist movement of Ghana, she is now cadre based in Burkina Faso. She is also a founder of the Thomas Sankara Center. From Cuba to Senegal, her anti-imperialist work has led her to involvement with indigenous communities across the Western Hemisphere, to her continental homeland. In addition to her experience as the communication director for the African Diaspora Alliance, she is also a contributor of Hood Communists and non-Western media such as Press TV. And I believe Sister Moya is going to introduce our third panelist if there's someone that also will be joining us, correct? No?
Yes, is the panelist on?
Not just yet.
Okay, so when they come, I'll introduce them and do their
Okay.
intro.
Okay, great. And so we'll go ahead and get started maybe with your opening statements. And so you each have about 10 minutes. And you were given a prompt, but I'll reread the prompt if that's helpful. So the struggle to defeat imperialism and patriarchy is being waged everywhere around the African world and on all fronts. Can you please offer reflections on what you consider to be the most pressing obstacles in the struggle to defeat imperialism and patriarchy in your part of the world? Additionally, what is your analysis on how those challenges can be overcome? And either of you can start.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Revolutionary greetings, comrades and friends. It is always wonderful to be able to join you all and celebrate Pan-African Women's Day and continue the tradition. And we hope that we make an impact as we struggle to do every year in raising the consciousness of our community, both locally and globally. As mentioned, I work with various organizations, including organizations that are connected at home, because our base is Africa. And to understand African women, we really need to be grounded in our relationship with African women at home on the continent. And so what we have been discussing with various organizations, including for the last 2 years, we led a campaign called African Women Must Lead with myself, 2 other cadre in the APRP, and 2 cadre in the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. Sister Mahal and Sister Zandiswa, we hope one of them will join us today. And through this campaign, the struggle was around the importance of African women taking the lead. As was mentioned in the opening statement, we are oftentimes silenced culturally. We are silenced in our inability to participate and the triple oppression that African women face. But during the last couple of years, especially during the COVID lockdown, our realities changed considerably. For us, African women in the villages, African women throughout the nations, and in the cities have been in isolation. We face violence both during the various wars that existed, the border wars that exist throughout the continent, the border wars that exist both in Central and South America, as well as the wars of political and economic isolation. Uh, the reality of child brides as economic relief for families that weren't able to eke out a living, or as a part of the tribal traditions that continued. These were the realities that African women and girls continue to face, to be sold into slavery. This was before COVID. This was during COVID and after COVID. These are the realities that exist, not just for African women, but for women in Asia, throughout Europe, and throughout the Western Hemisphere. And having been in a part of a missing women's group, particularly in our local area, that was led by former SNCC organizer and journalist with KPFK, Margaret Prescott. She initiated this campaign in the mid 1990s. And during that time, we organized various seminars, we did protests in the streets, and we distributed materials throughout the community to raise awareness that women were missing in our community. Hundreds of women missing, reported missing. Some of them may have been street workers, some of them may have just been going to the store, coming from school, going to school. But these women were missing and no one cared where they were. And it eventually got to the point where we were able to get the attention of a documentarian, a filmmaker, a European man that was interested in supporting the campaign. And so when he came on board, we were able to do some more research and investigation and document what was happening. And once that documentary really began to take hold in the press, that's when the LAPD and the Sheriff's Department got involved. And within a short period of time, they were able to find supposedly the killer of at least 40 of these women that were identified. And of course, this was an elderly African man that was found as the killer, but we know that it had to be more than one person involved. But the reality at the same time was that we were hearing the same complaints from the American Indian movement in the indigenous territories, in the reservations, in isolated areas where there are mining establishments throughout Canada and throughout North America, that women and girls are missing. Women and girls are found killed, and no one is identifying what these issues are. So this reality that women face, whether we are houseless, whether we are jobless or earning low wages, the reality is that there is violence in the home. And we found that particularly also talking to my sister, Anana Jumphy, who is the head of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, BAJI, is the calls that she was receiving from women that were now locked into their homes, that were here locally throughout the US, that could not leave. They were under the same similar threats that you would find on the continent, where they were being forced to marry, where they were under physical violence. Whatever the most emotional tenor in the home, it is meeked out on the women. And women and girls also suffer violence in school and in the churches. So there is no safe haven for African women and for women in general unless we politically educate and organize. These are the realities on the street. These are realities in our community. These are the realities that we're finding throughout the territories. And now immigration and people just leaving their territories is increasing because of the various wars throughout the continent, because of the devastation of not only wars that are instigated by the imperialist elements throughout Africa, you wonder how Boko Haram is getting their weaponry and their uniforms. How are these various jihadist groups being armed and tailored and prepared to go into various areas of the continent, particularly where there is mineral wealth that we find, whether it's crude oil, whether it's a magnesium or other important mineral substances that the corporations need. We find this displacement of the people through these various border wars. And so we know that this is spurred on by imperialism. And as a result, we find that there has been a significant increase in women leaving. And in fact, it was a statistic showed that the highest percentage of people living outside of their territories, outside of their homes, are African women and girls on the African continent, because we are being displaced by these wars. We are being displaced by the devastation, both militarily and ecologically. Whether it be the various floods that happen annually, whether it be the devastation of drought and the desertification of the Sahara Desert is increasing to encroach on Northern and East Africa and in West Africa as well. And so we find that African women, who are often the guardians and protectors of the family, the elders and the children, are the most impacted. And so now Baji is experiencing this increase of immigration, a necessity of support in the West. Folks are traveling all the way from Africa through Mexico, through Central and South America to get to America, which is the belly of the beast, the cause of the contradiction. But that's another struggle that we have to wage in terms of that. But the reality is that African women are suffering the most because they are the center of the family, and the destabilization that is happening in Africa impacts African women and youth the most. So we understand these are the same contradictions that we face here, where there is plenty of empty warehouses, but no one is taking responsibility to provide that as housing for the so-called houseless. In our communities, we're surrounded by people who are sleeping on the streets, people who are sleeping in their cars. If they have a little trailer, they're sleeping in their trailer or their van, and they're setting up tents on the side of the road. This is the reality even in America, and it is because capitalism and imperialism is relentless, and it has no heart. In fact, Lenin posed the question in 1939 that we would see ultra imperialism, super imperialism and capitalism, and that is exactly what we see. But the reason that it has spread, the reason that it is entrenched our continent since independence and after, is because of its partner, neocolonialism. And Nkrumah called it when he said, neocolonialism is the last stage of imperialism. It could not have encroached itself throughout Africa, throughout Central and South America, without a partnership of the local communities. And so that bourgeoisie, some of those being those founding so-called revolutionary parties, we shouldn't romanticize those who are now corrupt and are stealing the wealth of the people. These neocolonial elements that we see all around the room, heading every African nation almost in majority, these are the betrayers of Africa. These are the compradors of capitalism and imperialism, and they're selling Africa and Africa's resources inch by inch. Even in Gabon, where the most recent coup occurred, Ali Bongo's family had been in power for over 50 years. What is that if not a dictatorship? But the West is outraged because this means that their relationship to exploiting almost the largest reserve of manganese in Gabon, uh, spurting out 180,000 gallons of crude oil. Gabon is an OPEC nation, and France has the opportunity and has been the partner and probably more of the master of the extraction and production of that crude oil. So that oil does not belong to Gabon. All of these nation states are just divided territories of African people that were carved out and created in 1885 and 1886 through the Berlin Conference. Those resources don't belong to Gabon. They belong to all of Africa. But until Africa stands up and fights for its resources and fights for its people, then we will continue to see this exploitation. So we must begin to target these neo-colonialist elements. We need to identify every neo-colonialist party and leader that exists, and the masses of people need to rise up, organize themselves, and challenge these governments in the interest of not only our resources and our people, but also in the interest of humanity, because capitalism has done nothing but poison not only the culture and the society essence of what exists, but it also has poisoned the planet. It is destroying the planet. So for us to take our proper role as African women, we must address another issue: culture. There can be no revolution without African women, which has been said. But the barrier, a significant barrier, is the lack of a revolutionary culture. Oftentimes, it is our ethnic groups, it is our traditions, it's our religion. These are often a part of what is our culture. And these are the elements that continue to dictate what our place and what our role in society is, who we are, what positions we should hold, what role we should play. And the petty bourgeois that Cabral calls the anti-people class, they've existed since the fall of communalism. And with that, the power and the structure of African women in the matrilineal system as a part of the matriarchy has been under threat. And so we ask ourselves today, what can we do to move our struggle forward? How can we advance the revolution forward? The only way we can do that is the transformation of society through a cultural revolution that goes along with the political revolution. We must begin to identify and discuss our traditions and our behaviors. We must talk about why China had a cultural revolution, why it's struggled to erase the concept of civilization through the British eyes, civilization through the European eyes, and see civilization through Chinese eyes. What morals, what ethics will we follow as a people if we don't follow our own, and not those reactionary cultural elements, but only those that are positive, that are uplifting, that reflect the moral and ethical beliefs and foundation of African people. And so we have to call on our brothers as well as our sisters to say that we have to look at our culture, because we've all played a role. Even within neo-colonialism, the mothers, the aunties, the daughters, we play our role in sustaining neo-colonialism as well. Even our silence to not identify the reactionary elements of our culture, those who betrayed our people, those who betray our families, those who betray our principles. By our being liberal, we are in our own way participating in the colonial subterfuge, in the degrading of our people and our humanity. We have to begin to lift up our culture. Culture is the container of all that we do. And if our culture isn't revolutionary, then it is reactionary. And so we look to revolutionaries like Cabral. For us in the All African People's Revolutionary Party, we study revolutionaries and revolutions that have been successful. And we know that we have had great contributions on culture from our president, Ahmed Sekou Touré, and from our founder, Kwame Nkrumah. But we've also had great contributions on the issue of culture from the great Amilcar Cabral and the PAIGC, because they have had more time to take the revolution, which was successful, and continue to evolve it and develop it as they continue to build the movement in Guinea-Bissau. So we take our direction and our vision from those areas that work, where revolution exists. If we talk about what we have done since Pan-African Women's Day was called for, we ask those 14 revolutionary women's wings, have you continued to fight against neocolonialism? Have you continued to fight against imperialism? Have you continued to fight to uplift African women and youth? Have we continued to build a revolutionary culture and a revolutionary movement that moved us forward? If we have not, we must call out these parties that may not be revolutionary today, that were revolutionary yesterday, and ask them to stand up, that we reach forward to build a revolutionary culture, that we take examples from Cuba, that we take examples from the Eritrean women, of the Eritrean Women's Union, that recently told us that they banned, it is illegal to have child marriages. It's illegal to have female genitalia mutilation. These are etched in their constitution today because they continued the revolution even after winning the physical revolution of the border war. So we'd say today our solution is to keep target on the transformation of the culture. All of our parties can only be called revolutionary when we practice what we preach, when we practice our commitment to revolution, when we commitment to uplifting African women and youth, when we make our commitment in that wherever we organize, if we are in Kenya, we must see the recruitment of women. If we are in South Africa, we must see the recruitment of women. If we are in West Africa, we must see the recruitment of women, because women and girls are over 52 and sometimes 54% of the population. When we develop our relationship as an AWRU, we must ask ourselves, what relationships do we have with these other political parties? Because we can't continue to talk to ourselves. We must be talking to the masses of the people. And so when we talk to an ANC or a PAC, we are talking to 100,000, maybe millions of people. When we share and exchange our ideas and our thoughts, and we learn from them what they are doing and struggling with, we must build relationships, because the concept of the AACPC is not just a concept to be kept in a book. The concept is a living, growing development of relationships where we begin to understand who we are as African people and who we are as African women, and how we can forge together to build a revolutionary Pan-Africanist movement that is more than a movement, but as an objective for us all. So we are challenging ourselves to evolve the concept of just gender as just being gender. This concept is about reactionary culture versus revolutionary culture. It is here to evolve our human relationships, to revolutionize those, not just for men, women, and all exploited genders, but for all of humanity. And so we challenge ourselves to say that we must revolutionize our culture in practice. We must learn from those who are organizing in Cuba, in Vietnam, in Guinea-Bissau, and these territories where actually they are making progress, and we must learn from the progress that they're making. So for this, I offer my humble comments and analysis of where we are and where we need to go. So I say forward ever, backwards never. Forward to the revolutionary African cultural revolution.
That's right, forward ever. Thank you so much, Comrade Missouri. So y'all thought we were going to ease into this. No, we're jumping right in. We're jumping right in. We're getting down to business. Okay, so I'd like to hear from you, Inem, with the same prompt.
Okay, thank you so much for having me on, and I really appreciate being here, and I'm excited to participate in this. I think that your opening remarks, Comrade Evelyn, as well as what we just heard from Comrade Missouri, already cover so much of what I wanted to say. I think you made so many brilliant points. So I'll talk about a little bit of what's happening in my own organizing context, where I live and where I fight for Pan-Africanism on the ground. So some people, hopefully most people who are on this Zoom call are aware that Burkina Faso, as well as the Greater Sahel, are in a really having a really critical moment right now, where we have had a series of coups that have put in power, at the very least, anti-imperialist governments at the head of state in Mali, Burkina Faso, and it appears as well in Niger, and that there's also increasing significant retaliation on the side of the West, pushing back against some of these anti-imperialist leaders, but also anti-imperialist movements that are emerging from the ground. So I'd say, within this particular region of Africa, there's a lot of clarity among the people, regular working people, that imperialism is the primary contradiction in the world, and certainly in these countries that people have to struggle against. And so there's so much heightened consciousness everywhere you go. The big conversation is about imperialism. It's about defending the homeland, defending Africa. And a lot of people are also having very serious conversations about how Africa can unify and why Africa should unify. And these are that's where these countries are at right now, on the level of the people. And then increasingly, it appears also on the level of the heads of state who have come to take power. I think there's already so much that both of you have said that have touched on what that context of imperialism has looked at like over the past several decades, really since the 19th century and even prior with the slave trade, but at least since the 19th century with the establishment of formal sort of colonialism in Africa up until like the neo-colonial period. In these countries in particular, we've just seen France maintain an incredibly, closed, stronghold on these countries. Not to say that the West as a whole isn't actively involved in exploiting and draining these countries of their resources, but France in particular has been the most overt in calling the shots, especially politically. Within its former colonies, so within this across the Sahel and then other parts of its former colonies. And it's really women who, as you know, suffer the most dire consequences from imperialism and neocolonialism. And so, when we're talking about superexploitation, when we're talking about imperialism, it's women who suffer the most, who find themselves in the most dire conditions, who find themselves in the worst economic struggles, and as well as face to face with the most extreme forms of violence. During Comrade Missouri's opening, she talked about some of the forms of sexual violence that exist and are perpetuated, especially with these so-called jihadists, I'll say the terrorist organizations that have proliferated throughout the Sahel and other parts of Africa. And I'll just say, I think I'm going to just call them like paramilitary organizations. And, if we take seriously what the people who are within these zones who are fleeing from these parts of Africa are saying. There's so many reports of people saying that they have witnessed certain forms of collaboration between these so-called like French troops and US troops who are supposed to be fighting against these paramilitary groups. Meanwhile, the people are saying that they've witnessed too much overt collaboration. And now we have governments like Mali who are saying at the level of the UN, who are saying whatever sort of international audience that they can get, that France has supplied support to these paramilitary organizations in the form of technologies, as well as providing intelligence to these groups. Women are overwhelmingly caught up and suffering directly from this chaos and this violence. Also, I should mention, the blowback from the NATO invasion of Libya, which also played a tremendous role in proliferating the spread of these paramilitary organizations. There was a film that came out at, it came out and it was one of the biggest films at FESPACO, which is the Pan-African film festival. It's the biggest one in Africa, and it takes place every 2 years in Burkina Faso. And this year, the main film that was like all the rage, it won like the second place prize, but it was really like the one of the most popular films that people were going to see. It was called Sira, and Sira talks about, it's a film about women in particular who are suffering at the hands of this like imperialist rooted violence in the Sahel region. And I think in the past, in another context, particularly like I think especially outside of the Sahel, if this film had been like something that had blown up on an international level, it would have perhaps been used to sort of justify further Western intervention. We've seen, unfortunately, a lot of violence against women and girls and sexual violence being used almost as an excuse, as a narrative for the expansion of Western interference. So the campaign for like Bring Back Our Girls with Boko Haram, for example, in Nigeria, that was used by the United States, unfortunately, as a pretext to expand AFRICOM further into the African continent. But I think right now, with the contradictions as heightened as they are, and as much clarity around imperialism as there is on the ground, films exposing this reality of just extreme violence, particularly targeting women and girls, like the film Sira, which is, I don't know if I said it before, that's the name of the film. So I do encourage people to seek it out if you can stomach some of the violence in the film. It is a very important film that shows what it looks like, on the ground in terms of what women are suffering from because of these paramilitary organizations. So I think in the past, that kind of a film would have been used to sort of further justify imperialism. Now, when we watch these kinds of films on the ground in Burkina Faso, people talk about, I can't believe this is something that that the West is responsible for. This is something that imperialism has done to totally destabilize our countries. And this is where we're at. Because of the hands of countries like France, and people saying that that should have been represented and depicted in the film. Unfortunately, there's not that much independent, totally independent cinema in Africa right now. So because of the funding, we don't really have that much control over our own media narratives. Hopefully that will also change as we see further linkings with France within these countries. So I just wanted to underscore, that imperialism is the primary contradiction. It's the contradiction that people are struggling with and fighting against on the ground throughout the Sahel and throughout Africa and the African diaspora and the world at large. But it's women who are the most impacted and who suffer the most at the hands of imperialism, of militarism, and of these forms of intervention. So I think, another thing that I should touch on that's very important to the context of the Sahel and really important to this conversation are also the sanctions that have been placed on Mali and on and the pending sanctions on Niger. That are so there's ECOWAS sanctions on Niger. Those sanctions are very severe to such an extent that Niamey has had its lights turned off and has lacked power on several occasions since the sanctions were implemented. The cost of basic goods and items, food items, has already increased since the sanctions were implemented. And there's been a lot of confusion around, like, people trying to withdraw money in banks, and that being like not always possible. At one point, people were saying that it was limited to 10,000 CFA, so that's around maybe like $18. And it hasn't been consistent, but I think there's been a lot of already immediate hardships. We've seen immediately since the ECOWAS sanctions were imposed on Niger that regular people were hit immediately and have already begun to bear the brunt of of those sanctions. And these are sanctions that are encouraged by both France and the United States. Right now, in the level of the EU, Germany is at the forefront of pushing for EU sanctions on Niger. So it would not just be ECOWAS, but also international EU sanctions on Niger. Mali is already sanctioned by the EU, and just last month, the United States also placed sanctions on Mali as well, claiming that Mali is collaborating with Wagner, the Russian group, which the Malian government has never confirmed. They've never said that they are. However, we also understand that that's not something that the United States or Europe has the right to determine. They don't get to decide which partnerships or alliances African countries form. And these sanctions are illegal. Sanctions legally within international law, before they're implemented, there is a legal process that's required, and that almost never happens when the United States, Europe, or Canada impose sanctions on other parts of the world. And so we know that it's women who are going to face these consequences more so than anyone else. Men, of course, are also facing the consequences and are struggling under the sanctions. We understand that women are also going to suffer, and suffer economically more because they have less economic economic power already in their hands, and they're often responsible for a lot of the sort of household responsibilities that are being directly impacted by these sanctions. So the lights are off, the food prices are rising. These are things that that women are hit with first before anyone else. So I think this context of understanding what imperialism looks like within the region is so important. Burkina Faso has not had those level of sanctions yet, but because both of our neighbors on both sides who have taken a similar direction to us have been hit with those sanctions, we are also bracing ourselves and asking the question of, okay, what's going to happen? Especially as Ibrahim Traoré, the president of Burkina Faso, is taking these bold positions against Western imperialism and clearly forming alliances outside of this Western bloc. So that's the circumstances and the conditions that we find ourselves in the Sahel. I'll say that, in all honesty, if I speak just what the reality is, I think, we have widespread, clear consciousness right now that imperialism is the primary contradiction, but I think other contradictions like patriarchy are not being addressed sufficiently within Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger right now. I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to address patriarchy as a contradiction. So we do see that women are taking out into the streets and they are mobilizing, and there are women in Pan-African organizations. But I will say that they tend to be much more invisible than the men are. And there are a lot of conversations that we're having within Pan-African groups in Burkina Faso in terms of how can we get more women involved. I think sometimes the blame gets pinned on women, like why don't women show up? Why aren't women interested in politics and Pan-Africanism? And I don't really think that's probably talk to women. We do see women pay attention. They are really conscious of what's happening. Women are vocally critical of France, vocally critical of the United States, vocally critical of NATO, I should say, as a whole, because I think increasingly consciousness has shifted from a very sort of focus on French imperialism to one where we're starting to understand NATO as an alliance that works together and collaborates together. And I think, you know, women are following what's happening, but it is true that we do lack women's participation in a lot of our movements on the ground. We don't have the numbers compared to men. And I think Pan-Africanism for a long time has been kind of treated as like a boys club. So when we go to a lot of spaces, unfortunately, this just to speak to the reality, when we go to a lot of spaces that are like Pan-African panels or, you know, mobilizations, like student-led groups, we go out to speak to different people, do workshops, etc. Usually overwhelmingly we'll get like a room filled with men, and then maybe sometimes there'll be like a few women who are in the room. And so this is a big question that we're raising on the ground, you know, where are the women? Why aren't they showing up? And, you know, a lot of times when you ask the women, you know, why, the women who are involved, at least, you know, the ones who are with us, like we'll ask, like, what do we think is like deterring other women? You know, we do realize that there are big social contradictions. A lot of women feel that, and it's not, I don't want to actually reduce it to women's feelings, but there is a cultural dynamic where some people, and I'll say both men and women, because both men and women uphold patriarchy, find it maybe threatening to the household to have women who are so politically engaged. And maybe in some ways, if we're defining, you know, the values of the household as values in which women are contributing overwhelmingly within the household and men are working outside, then yeah, it is threatening. I mean, that is legitimately a threat to that sort of dynamic. So we look back and we reference Thomas Sankara as an example of somebody who really addressed this contradiction head on. At the same time, I realize, you know, I'm in a position where I'm forced to ask and question, you know, why do we have this very sort of, why do we have this sort of exploitation of women? And why do we have this really like clear delineation between, you know, the women's role within the house and the men's role maybe more outside of the house? Like, where does that come from? And we understand that, you know, it is cultural, but we also understand that culture doesn't just, you know, fall from the sky, or we don't just like have a dream and the dream is our culture. We understand that culture is tied to our material reality, and that exploitation comes from like the production and the productive forces within the society that we're at. And so what does production look like? And we know that, you know, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are the more extreme end of unindustrialized countries and countries lacking certain technologies and certain resources. That's a reality of the history of super exploitation, of the history of imperialism, of the history of this really, like I said, firm grip that France and the West as a whole has had on these countries for a long time. It has led to a material reality in which most people lack a lot of technologies that are more common in other parts of the world. And without those things, there does become a need for certain forms of a certain maybe division of labor. It doesn't necessarily have to be a gendered one. We push against that, but we realize that, you know, for example, if people don't have refrigerators in their home, many people in Burkina Faso don't, that means that there has to be somebody who's going to be cooking every single day. You know, that there has to be somebody that's you know, that does become a responsibility that's necessary. If we don't have washing machines, and those are very uncommon, and we're living in a climate where there's a lot of dust and there's a desert kind of climate, and that's just the reality. And, you know, there's households with multiple children. That means that there has to be somebody who's hand washing clothes all the time. And so this kind of reality forces myself and others to unpack, you know, what are the roots of this gendered sort of division of labor, and why does it exist? And we understand that a lot of it is tied to production, it's tied to the material reality of these places. Also, we realize that a lot of times the employment opportunities for men and for women are very different. So a lot of the work in Burkina Faso, like the sort of biggest opportunities for work tend to be jobs that tend to target men and tend to rely a lot on brute force. So things like the mining sector, there's a lot of construction jobs. Women are involved in these jobs as well, but they tend to be overwhelmingly dominated by men. There tend to be less economic opportunities for women because, you know, we're not in a stage in these countries where we're transforming these materials into finished products, which maybe could be done by any worker, perhaps, you know. So I think we have to look at what kinds of production exists within these countries as well. So just to say, I think there's a struggle that needs to be twofold. So just, I'm going to reiterate, you know, imperialism as a primary contradiction, and imperialism as the lead cause in women's suffering and struggles in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, across the African continent, across the diaspora, and across the world. And then also, you know, because of what imperialism has done to these countries, you know, we have a twofold struggle. One where we need to address the contradiction already right now in the present. We need to do that by making it clear that Pan-Africanism is not and has never actually been a boys' club, that women have always contributed to Pan-Africanism, have always had a role in the struggle against imperialism, and that needs to be recognized. There needs to be more of a historical understanding that is widespread. There needs to be more propaganda around that. And then the other side is also recognizing that culture is tied to production and is tied to the material reality where we live. And so while we're struggling to create the propaganda and struggling to spread their political education, we also need to struggle to change the material reality. And that doesn't necessarily also mean that we have to wait and wait. We are in a different sort of we have a, you know, socialism or different mode of production before, you know, we can start integrating women into struggle. It also means that we can ask questions like, okay, how can we collectivize some of this labor so it doesn't have to fall on the hands of just, you know, one or two individuals within a household? You know, how can, you know, even if men are working outside in certain fields, it doesn't mean that all the men are, and it doesn't mean that there are not men that cannot come and step in and relieve some of these household responsibilities. And it also doesn't mean that women as a whole cannot get together and collectivize their work, which I think, you know, that is also what is done. And I think that also plays the biggest role in helping people to survive under these conditions. So we do see a lot of collectivization of the household responsibilities. You know, we'll see like women getting together and collectivizing things like childcare, and then, you know, cooking, etc., and working on that together, which makes it a lot easier then for women to have the capacity to participate in our organizations and in our movements. But I think we need to do that more and more. And I think we should, I think we also should, like, I think it's done. People have, like, you know, maybe like an intrinsic sort of basic understanding in terms of, like, you know, why that's necessary, but I think we can politicize that even further. And I think that's also like a way that we can start to open up more conversations around patriarchy. There's a lot more that I can say, but maybe I'll stop here because I know we have some questions, and then hopefully there's other stuff I can add into the questions as well.
Thank you so much, Comrade Inemaset. I really appreciate the contextual analysis that you and Comrade Missouri have given us, and the way that you all have emphasized the, you know, how the material conditions and the places that we live, you know, uniquely shape the experiences that we have as African women, you know, across the diaspora. And so I think our third panelist has joined us. And so I want to offer the floor to her to also respond to the prompt, and I can repeat the question, but maybe Comrade Missouri could first introduce our third panelist.
Yes. Let us welcome our comrade sister, Mahal Peko, who I've known most of my life in the All African People's Revolutionary Party. She is a Central Committee member in PAC. We have worked together when her father was president of the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, Dr. Peko, we worked closely with PAC. We facilitated, we even brought, he was on tour here. We had a speaking tour. And when we decided that we wanted to train AWRU members, for those of you that are new to the APRP and AWRU, we actually had a training program where we sent two sisters volunteered to go to Azania, and Sister Mahal was a part of that nurturing and developing community to welcome these sisters and develop relationships and help to integrate them as they developed and worked closely with the PAC. So Sister Mahal has been our right-hand sister. When we talk about unity, when we talk about solidarity, when we talk about building the ACPC, we're talking about a Pan-African unity where we work hand in hand with each other on a regular basis. And Sister Mahal has been a shining example of revolutionary women who are writers, who are speakers, who understand history and analysis, who are out in the field working amongst the people, and has been an inspiration to generations of those in not only the APRP and the AWRU, but especially in Southern Africa and all the regions that she has traveled and worked. So let us warmly welcome our revolutionary Pan-African sister, Mahal Peko.
Welcome, Comrade Mahal, and I'll repeat the prompt just in case you need it again. And so the prompt was: the struggle to defeat imperialism and patriarchy is being waged everywhere around the African world and on all fronts. Can you please offer reflections on what you consider to be the most pressing obstacles in the struggle to defeat imperialism and patriarchy in your part of the world? What is your analysis on how those challenges can be overcome?
Good evening, sisters and Israel, to all of you. Thank you so much. What a privilege and an honor to be part of this important Pan-African Women's Day 2023. It's wonderful, again, always to reaffirm our solidarity with the All African Women's Revolutionary Union, and a great greetings from us here from the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. Indeed, let me actually take off from the previous sister. I'm sorry I did not get her name. I joined a little bit late. But let me say that I want to speak in the context of BRICS. You will know that South Africa recently hosted the BRICS nation: Brazil, Russia, China, South Africa. Now it has been expanded. More countries have been added. It's a very interesting kind of hodgepodge that has been put together, adding Iran, adding Saudi Arabia, adding the United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Argentina in Latin America. Obviously, a number of countries also have applied to become members of the BRICS nation. But why is the BRICS so significant for us to discuss as women, and to also locate what is happening, I think, geopolitically around the world? When we look at the expansion of the BRICS now, it now has a collective GDP of 29.2, which is beginning to rival the G7 countries. It now also has almost 30% control of oil in terms of the countries that are OPEC and that give us the resources for energy. This is extremely significant now, particularly when you begin to look at the arrogance of countries like France, which also, by the way, had applied to become a BRICS country. Now, when we look at BRICS, we had anticipated that, one, it would contribute to the de-dollarization of trade in the world, which is very, very important. Secondly, it would act as a very important counter to this neo-colonialism that we are seeing in the world, and an anti-imperialist agenda. Unfortunately, when one looks at what came out, the resolutions that came out of this particular meeting here in South Africa, there is a little bit of backpedaling, particularly on the South African side. We were the hosts, and it was interesting to listen to the president. He did not mention the issue of de-dollarization. He did not mention BRICS as an important counter, particularly to the G7 countries to the West and to the imperialist agenda. This was extremely disappointing, but at the same time, it also gives us as Pan-Africanists, I think, the opportunity to push, to continue to push BRICS with Egypt and Ethiopia on board now as the new African countries within the BRICS is absolutely critical for us to continue to push and become a major counter, I think, to the imperialism that we are experiencing, especially now with growing sanctions. We already have more than 13 African countries living under sanctions, and as the previous sister stated, Niger also as the latest, Burkina, Mali, Egypt has some sanctions against it as well, DRC, Central African Republic. And when you begin to look at the composition of these countries, all of these countries are mineral rich in one way or the other. So it was important, in fact, for BRICS to sort of push much harder as a counter force that can begin to collapse not only NATO, but also the G7 in particular, and France in particular, in its role of continuing to dominate West African countries, in particular the French-speaking countries. It's critical, I think, for us, I think, now to regroup, because in our view, the Pan-Africanist agenda is more fundamental than ever, especially as women. One sister is right when you look at what's happening to women in the Sudan, in the midst of this war. It is painful. And when you look at the way in which women have been discarded just as citizens of their own country, discarded without food, without electricity, without water, without proper healthcare, that the army, the one side of the army would think that it's okay to bomb hospitals and clinics, is something that we have to absolutely stand up for. I think as women, we need to be in part of the peace and resolution and conflict resolution platforms, especially Pan-Africanist women. We are not there. And so what happens is it tends to become a very liberal exercise, a very technical exercise, and does not delve deep into the anti-colonial struggle and into the foundations of colonialism that have actually breeded the kinds of things that we are seeing now. When I look at Niger with all its uranium and all of this uranium going to light up the streets of France, and Niger itself does not have sufficient electricity for its own people, this is outrageous. We have to, we can't just treat this as an overthrow of a horrible leader. But at the same time, we cannot at the same time affirm unconditionally the military takeovers, because they've also participated in the rape of women, in the violence against women, in these conflicts. So we have to be, I think, quite careful in terms of which side we stand on. We stand on the side of Pan-Africanism. This is the time that we need to build collectively a women's movement, an African women's movement, a very strong solidarity movement, not only just in West Africa, throughout the African continent. We have to begin to look at the natural resource game. Begin to look at where the resources are, why these countries are so important to the West, and begin to highlight to our people the importance of these minerals for our own development, first of all, and to begin, I think, to collaborate very, very strongly against the extraction industry that leaves children, women digging for pedals. In here in this country, we have in South Africa, we have a serious problem with what we call Zama miners, so-called illegal miners, who are literally blowing us up underground. But we're also seeing children, we're seeing women desperate to make a living, participating in these illegal mining activities under very dangerous circumstances. Somebody blew up some gas, which killed a lot of people just a few weeks ago. Our own downtown also suffered a serious explosion. And so in a way, there's a collusion also with our governments in terms of colluding with these illegal activities. A lot of corruption ongoing there. And women, again, discarded, women, again, not thought of, and their families in terms of the consequences of allowing these sorts of activities right in the neighborhoods where people live and not caring what should happen. So we need better solidarity. I loved the analysis of the previous sister. We have to, I think, build solidarity around the sorts of analysis, that sort of analysis, really linking the geopolitics of what is happening around us, re-looking again at Pan-Africanism as a tool, as an ideology, as a way forward to transform and to really change the scenario of what is happening, for example, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, in Mali. It can't just be lip service. As I said, we cannot trust the military. We've seen military takeovers. We've seen it in Egypt, where the military has now become the civilian government, and it is detrimental to the lives of women in countries like Egypt. We are seeing it in Sudan. We are going to see it in Niger, whether we like it or not. We are going to see it in Burkina and in Mali, despite the fact that there are very strong women there. But they need our solidarity. They need us, one, to create exposés of what is happening in these countries, and to, once again, I think, flash out why sanctions are at the center of many of our countries, and the mineral resource rich countries, and to talk about these minerals, the importance of them, the industrial diamonds that are in all of our computers that come out of the DRC, the important minerals that come out of Egypt for the cement and the construction industry. So we need to connect these, not just talk about the minerals just as minerals, but to look at the control, to look at the domination around this, as well as to really show people that we'd rather these minerals remain underground until we are ready as African people to develop, to innovate, and to be creators of things that people need to use, appliances, and a whole lot of other issues. I just want to touch very quickly on some of these assets that I am talking about, and why they are frozen. And you look at Guinea Conakry, 25% of the world's bauxite comes out of Guinea. Iron ore, also out of Guinea, the 13th leading diamond producing country. So bauxite, as I said, used for cement, used for different, even cosmetics, by the way. And these, the West, the imperialists, want to dominate these issues. We look at countries like Burundi, which has copper, which has a little bit of uranium, which has cobalt, which has nickel. All of these are important for refining oil and gas. So you begin to see, and they're important also for the aerospace industry, for the auto industry, for the military hardware that is needed. So once you begin connecting these mineral resources and why there's destabilization in these countries, then once they've destabilized, sanctions applied, and under sanctions, because it's almost a lawless kind of environment. These, the French in particular, are able to go into these countries unseen, invisible, and literally steal these natural resources. In the meantime, the United Nations has all these resolutions on sanctions. They will sanction against electricity, cut off water. Why? Why are they doing this? So we really have to stand up. Lastly, you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's got cobalt. Cobalt, very, very important mineral. That is found in the DRC, important for electronics. They've got lithium. Lithium now is what we find in our batteries, to charge our cell phones. So these assets, this fight that we are seeing now, I think is a more vicious fight. It is a fight that Nkrumah spoke of in his exposés on neocolonialism. And we have to identify what is happening, define it very, very clear. We have to build solidarity with women in every country here on the continent. People of African descent, we have to come together as women, again, as I said, to really expose what is happening, because a lot of our people don't make the connections. And it's important that we really look at this. Coming back to BRICS. BRICS, yes, is going to be stronger, but stronger for your companies, stronger mostly for China. And if you look at the share of trade that China enjoys within the BRICS nation, they literally overwhelm all of us. And this is not we're not talking about a benevolent China and a benevolent country. As we talk amongst ourselves, they are also have very imperialistic ambitions on the African continent. Russia too, the sister was talking about Wagner. I mean, these mutinous forces that come and they take over the security of an entire country. We can't welcome entities like Wagner into our countries. They are not here for us. They're here to not only examine what natural resources are there, and under the pretext of looking after our security, siphon off the very natural resources which France and everybody else wants. I pause, Madam, I pause.
Well, thank you so much, Comrade Mahal, for that powerful entrance into the discussion. And so I have one question that I want to pose to our panelists, and we'll have about 3 minutes for each of you to respond, because we want to address at least a couple of the audience questions, if that's possible. And so my question for our 3 panelists is, what are some of the current shortcomings of the movement to build Pan-Africanism in addressing the needs of women? How can organizations like the All-African People's Revolutionary Party and Africans outside of the continent better understand the material realities of women on the continent? And let me know if I should repeat that.
Yeah, can you repeat the questions? It looks like it was a couple of questions.
Yes, it is. It is. So I'll read them a little bit slower as well. What are some of the current shortcomings of the movement to build Pan-Africanism and addressing the needs of women? How can organizations like the All-African People's Revolutionary Party and Africans outside of the continent better understand the material realities of women on the continent?
Okay, maybe I can respond to that if that's all right. Wait, sorry, let me refresh myself on the first point. The current shortcomings of the movement to build Pan-Africanism and addressing the needs of women, and then understand the material realities of the continent. Okay, so I think one of the things that comes to mind off the bat is I think we really need to understand the different both the material differences as well as the different historical context within which women are organizing across Africa and the African diaspora. Because even though we find that we're in a very similar position in terms of we're all targeted and in various ways suffering under the hands of Western imperialism. We have the same enemies wherever we are on the continent and the diaspora. There are historical differences and differences in our material reality that need to be understood. For example, the coups and the military governments in Africa, sometimes they're all sort of lumped together, like the military's taking over Africa, or there's a coup belt. But we need to understand the historical context and also the differences, the historical and contemporary differences between some of these coups, for example. So we have Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, who are 3 military governments that are taking a strong position against imperialism. And there are women's organizations who are meeting with these leaders like Ibrahim Traoré. They're in conversation with some of the women's groups in Burkina Faso. And so while we see that, they may come out of the military, we also remember that Thomas Sankara also came out of the military and also came via coup. So, that's a very different reality than, for example, in a place like Chad, where Chad had a coup and it was the guy's son, Idris Debi's son, Mohammed Debi, who took power, and protesters came out in the street, including women, who organized a special women's mobilization, and protesters were shot at. So it's a very different, this is a big juxtaposition. We have on the one hand, we can say coup leaders, transition leaders, maybe it's better, who are overwhelmingly siding with the positions of the people, and who are trying, at least some of them, we can say, seem to be trying to better understand sort of the legacy of military leaders like Thomas Sankara. They may not be there entirely, but there is at least an effort on some of the leaders to try to understand, okay, what was that particular history? And then we have other coups like Chad. We have a context like in Gabon, for example, where unfortunately the new leader is somebody who's another relative, again, of the Bongo family, who's involved in various forms of corruption, scandals, and pillage. So I think there's, just like just like we see other forms of leadership, we see like civilian leaders, we have like bourgeois democracies, and then we have, socialist leaders who maybe don't represent that. I think we also have to look at the dynamics of these coups. And so, this is often also sometimes a class question in terms of like the ranking of these military leaders, and their position within the military often also determines to what extent they'll end up siding with the people. So I think that's very important context if we're going to understand some of the material differences, between these sort of African states, and then, also the position that they will take in regards to women and women's positions within the country.
Absolutely. Thank you, comrade.
Sister Mahal, you want to jump in before I say something?
Okay, let me do that. Some excellent points. Thank you very much to our comrade sister before, who spoke just now. I think that one of the biggest challenges I think that we have faced as women, and we need to find a different road around this. One, we've relied on men, and we have often got into their factional fights, which often disorganize us. This is the experience that we have had here in Azania. And it's a very, very difficult challenge. Women who speak out, women who make noise, women who are not afraid to say the things that need to be said, are often ostracized, are often bullied, and many of them actually leave the movement. And so we end up with due respect, with sometimes many women who are too afraid to say anything, too timid to say anything, and have often relied on men for ascending into positions of power. So it's very, very difficult for them to turn around later and disagree with these men. We've also been gatekeepers of patriarchy ourselves, which has played a very detrimental role. Partly because sometimes I think that we are afraid to talk about patriarchy for fear of being labeled a radical African feminist within the movement. And so there is a silencing and a censorship of ourselves because, we've been gatekeeping, and then after realizing that this was not a very good strategy, very, very difficult to reverse that. We also increasingly now, I think, particularly as we participate in parliamentary politics, the politics of the stomach, the politics of corruption, the politics of expediency also come into play. There's a class divide as well, a greater division between grassroots organizers, grassroots women, and the revolutionary intelligentsia and the intellectuals. And yet we all need to be in the same room. We all have something magnificent to contribute to our liberation, and it's critical that we also are beginning to see a tendency of populist or populism, because Pan-Africanism is not sexy. This ideology, this policy, this dream is too complex for us to talk about with a narrative that actually shows people how we can develop our countries, how we can develop self-determination, how we build solidarity and unity, not only just amongst ourselves, but throughout the African continent. So I see these as some of the barriers, and I think that we need more political consciousness. We need more intergenerational conversations between young women, middle women, the elders. This is absolutely critical because there is experience that can be shared up and down the line that is absolutely fundamental. Finally, Pan-Africanism is the only alternative for us as African people. And we have to find an important narrative that links to the question of land, that links to the question of mineral extraction, that links to the issues that many of us need: water, electricity, everyday things, unemployment, youth unemployment. But not only that, celebrating the fact that Africa is the youngest continent in the world with the youngest populations. And look at what this can do for the African continent, and how we infuse their understanding of Pan-Africanism in order to rebuild a new Africa. And I think it is possible. Izwe too.
Thank you, Comrade. Sister Missouri, do you want to add?
Izwe to We Africa. Thank you, sisters. I think good points were raised, and I wanted to highlight one of the critical ones. I think the cultural component that I was speaking of, and Sister Neem also discussed, it lends itself to the liberalism. We want to give in to the line, and it is a weakening of the line and a weakening of the revolutionary moral and ethical directive that we have all given in on. And even inside of the party, as we get older, we're softer, we're kind of letting things slide, and whatever. And so we lose the revolutionary content, the vigor and the command. I was reading an old memo that Kwame Ture had written. And he was talking about, back in the day, the cadre didn't spare any bones. They gave it to you as it was. And he was talking about how if we are not ready to do the work and make the commitment, then we should just step down and let those who are ready do the work. And in some cases, remove those. And that is how we should be. And that is the concept and the commitment that we should have towards the neo-colonial governments. Because if it's Black, we don't want to criticize it. Oh, it's the white man, it's the white man, it's the imperialist. It is definitely the imperialist, but the imperialists can't do what they do without the comprador class, without the neo-colonialists, without our brothers and sisters who compromise the line, who compromise our resources, who compromise the integrity of the African Revolution. And so we have to see every step of liberalism as a betrayal of the revolution, and we have to fight against it. Another important point that you made that is a weakness in our movement is the Superman, Superwoman concept. Yes, we looked up to men, but we haven't revered the masses and the contribution that they make, and the women and the youth who are all dead and buried on the battlefields in Zimbabwe, throughout Southern Africa and Central Africa, who fought for Namibia's independence. Who the bodies are everywhere over Ethiopia and Eritrea. We haven't talked about the contribution of the masses. And so many of us run around like super women and super men, and we want the credit for everything because that's what we see. And on social media, we see this and we see that one. But the long-lasting revolution, the victory was not won by Ho Chi Minh. It was won by the Vietnamese people. The women and the children and the men who sometimes blew themselves up, who dug holes and created those caves, who went underground to carry out their revolution and to come up. It wasn't won by Amilcar Cabral. He made a significant contribution, but it was the masses of the Party of African Independence in Guinea and Cape Verde, the PAIGC. They won the revolution and they continue to sustain the revolution. We must get out of this concept and understanding that everything is won by Marvel Comics concepts, the Superman, the Iron Man, the Iron Woman, whatever. We really need to understand, like in Cuba that maintains its revolution, is when they trained these 20,000 youth in the first Ana Bellacourt school in Cuba. And many of the girls said, well, I need a sewing machine because we need to be able to sew our own clothes. They said, we'll give each student a sewing machine, but you have to commit to training 10 other people on how to sew and allowing them to use the machine. We have to build a mass movement, not an elitist movement, not a vanguard movement, but a mass movement. It is the masses of the people who win this revolution. And so we need to get out of romanticizing the revolution. It is not won by the great individual. It is won by the masses. And so women especially need to realize that even on this event, we have a lot of our brothers supporting us. We need women to understand the technical aspect of doing these broadcasts. We need women to be on these and preparing themselves to do these presentations. We need to go amongst the community and be in our communities. When we talk about what are we doing, what are the needs of the women, go to the women. That's why in my community, I hold a local Pan-African Women's Day to bring all the women out so that they can speak for themselves. They talk about what they are doing. And we're talking about, instead of all the trips you do to Cuba, how about you take that you learned in Cuba and in the LA Renters Union programs, you begin politically educating the people to talk about why Cuba is a shining example of why capitalism is failing. And the renters issues that we talk about today, we need to just take the society and take these buildings and take these homes and create residence for ourselves. We need a revolution. We need socialism and not capitalism. We need to set the examples and not how many trips can I go to Cuba or to Africa and running here and there. We need to be amongst the people. We need to get to know all of the women's organizations. one at a time on a regular basis, the way we do with PAC, where we are talking with them constantly, engaging with them, finding out what they're doing. We need to do that amongst each other and in our local areas. With this discussion we had recently where we talked about culture, the Indigenous sisters said, we want you to speak again to our Chicano forum where they have thousands of women. And let's talk about culture, because the same kind of contradictions is what I'll call them, that go on, the same kind of violence, it goes on the reservations and off. It goes on in the barrio. It goes on in our communities. The same violence. No revolution will be won. And those of us who are here, if we think we can just be revolutionaries and not unite and help, regenerate and support our indigenous communities here, we're mistaken. We don't understand revolution is mass. And so these are the shortcomings, is overcoming our petty bourgeois concept that we are the savior revolutionary, we're the super revolutionary. That is a serious contradiction that we need to get over in our liberalism. And if we want to know what the people are suffering from, what the women are coming from, we need to have regular, not just annual, we need to have regular communications with each other, with our sisters on the ground, interact, exchange information, get to know, so that we can build real unity.
Much appreciation, Comrade Missouri. And I want to also thank the entire panel, Unemisat, Comrade Mahal, Comrade Missouri. This has just been amazing. Honestly, some people talk and don't say anything. And then some people say just a few things and give you whole life lessons. And I feel like that's what y'all have provided us today. And I really appreciate that. And the audience does as well. And so I want to try to squeeze in at least one of the audience questions for you all before we conclude the panel. So let me see here. And I'll read it a couple of times. So this is a question from the audience. Could you share some strategies for building solidarity between Pan-African women in the United States and those in other parts of the African diaspora to address common challenges? And I'll read that once more. Could you share some strategies for building solidarity between Pan-African women in the United States and those in other parts of the African diaspora to address common challenges?
I can just say that the solidarity that we have with our sisters in PAC is a solidarity of sweat and blood. It's a solidarity of being with each other for decades and not just once a year. Where we engage regularly, where we exchange regularly, where we even will, show our granddaughters, our grandbabies, and whatever, we interact. And we did a campaign, as I mentioned earlier, for about a year on African Women Must Lead. And we did in between meetings to plan those quarterly sessions where we talked about African women must lead, and we talked about what the challenges are, who stands in our way, and we gave each other inspiration. We had each other's back. We encouraged each other so that after this campaign, we were inspired, and obviously PAC was inspired, because from this we have 2 Central Committee members, in PAC, and so it's that relationship, and PAC has inspired us. They welcomed us, they trained our sisters, they continued, they put their president on the road you know, Dr. Pecco, and other members who have come. We exchange, we do speaking engagements. So we used to do recruitment drives. The APRP used to coordinate recruitment drives. And those recruitment drives were political education drives as well, where we put PAC on the road, where we put PAIGC and Jacques and Udamu on the road. So we can have those same kind of relationships. We just need to have that commitment, that fire, that we want to know more, that we want to put them on the road, that we want to go there and be on the road. We just have to make the commitment, and it can be done. And it's the same thing. My relationship with La Raza Unida, since those young people were children and they carried my son, and now they're 40 and my son is almost 40 and they have children and they're the leadership of La Raza Unida. And they call me auntie, I'm their tia. That's being with the movement all the time. The American Indian movement, the same. And so it's something you can't do on the computer. It's something that we can't do. I hate to say that, but it's not a social media thing, you know. It's not a social, it's a real life experience that we have to develop real relationships and get to know. And we need to do that with the Eritrean sisters in Ethiopia, connect with the sisters in Sudan. We have a new sister in our circle from Algeria, and she's connecting us with the sisters in her area. And everywhere we are, we need to make those real life connections and do real work. And that's the only thing I can say. That is, it's not. I know the advent of social media, but this is not about social media. It's about revolution, and we have to do it on the ground as well as using technology. But in some areas, folks don't have internet access. And so we have to go into these regions where we don't have that. And that's how PAIGC wins elections. They go into the villages where the people are. We have to do the same.
Thank you, Nafi Nemiset. Our Comrade Mohau want to add on in the last couple of minutes that we have.
I'll be just super brief, because actually I was going to say something very similar to what Comrade Mzuri said. So I think she said it just very well. But you know, I feel like it's wonderful that Africans around the world want to connect with one another, and I think kind of similar to what Comrade Mzuri is saying. At least, you know, and the African continent's not all the same. So I'll just speak best to what I know. You know, we have to also do it in a way that that is compatible with the material conditions of the people where they're at. And so like what Comrade Mzuri was saying, not all of our people are going to be able to like hop on a Zoom call for hours and hours. Not everybody is even familiar with this kind of a platform. So I really think we need to start looking for more creative ways. I really just want to second what Comrade Mzuri said, to be doing more work in person and on the ground. So for example, for our African Liberation Day in Burkina Faso, we received a delegation of comrades from Ghana, including one of the sister comrades, Fifeme, who came and met with one of our sister comrades, Fachu. And now they're in communication, they know each other, they have like this link across the borders. Young women struggling in Africa, you know, who know each other. I just think it just makes a world of a difference. It's just a different experience. So I just really want to emphasize what Comrade Mzuri said. I think that in-person work is so important. And I know not everybody can, you know, hop on a plane and come out. So I think there's other ways and we can explore creative ways. But I do think that right now we're just too reliant on Zoom. We're too reliant on like what comrades had said, like social media, these things that are more distant and just really not accessible, like internationally, cross-culturally, given where you know, different people are at. So yeah, maybe this is somewhat a non-answer to just say to think creatively, more creatively, but I do think, you know, if we are able to do more work towards getting us together in person, I really think these things transform people's lives. Like I know I don't like travel just for the sake of travel, but I do think that when African people, you know, we have been denied through slavery, through colonialism, through imperialism, the opportunity to know one another. And that is our birthright. You know, we are all Africans. We all belong to Africa. All of Africa belongs to all of Africans. So we do have a right to know each other, and we should not have to be confined to these little micronations that were carved out for us in Berlin or during the transatlantic slave trade. So I really think there is a work that does need to go into fighting that, to kind of find ways to get us together. I do understand what Comrade Mzuri said, that it's not travel just for travel's sake. We have to do it, you know, be where the people are at. And I think sometimes there's also a need for, when we get to a certain point, you know, we've had these opportunities to travel, to meet Africans face to face, to organize on the ground with them. Maybe at that point, you know, we step back and we say, oh, okay, well, we have comrades here who have never had that opportunity, and they've never, you know, there's comrades that I know who have never left their hometown, you know, and think sometimes you need to figure out, okay, how can we now, you know, transfer sort of what we have to these folks, because I really think it makes a difference. Like, I really believe that if Africans who are in Guinea-Bissau, Burkina Faso, Azania, Zimbabwe, Haiti, the United States, you know, Brazil, like if some of these people who are at the forefront do have that opportunity to have those more personal relationships and the more people to people ones, I think these are experiences that transform lives. And I think that's also a form of political education that's very underrated. You don't really forget that kind of an experience. So I think, you know, I just think that for those of us who have had those kinds of opportunities, I think we should prioritize helping other people who maybe haven't have that kind of experience. Just to say, the delegation we received Ghana to Burkina Faso, you know, it was just a few days. And after ALD, both sides were just like, wow. Like on my end, like in Burkina, the comrades are like, I understand the APRP in a way I've never understood it before. Like, I really see it. These comrades, they've been in the APRP, like do some sort of work study circle process for 11 years. I see the way they're talking. Like, I see, you know, what the future is looking like. You know, I think it clicked. And, you know, and then the comrades in Ghana were like, oh my gosh, like the struggle in Burkina Faso, like, I can't wait to get back. Like, we need to have these kind of connections. So I really, really believe we need to be doing more, as much as we can, in person. And we do need to be building these personal relationships. And we do need to be a little, you know, less reliant on tools that are maybe not as accessible. It's good, you have technologies. We're doing a Zoom call right now that's wonderful. And I know that 20 years ago, we couldn't be doing this. So I appreciate it. But I think these are tools, and the revolution is not going to happen on Zoom. So I know I'm kind of repeating what Comrade Mzuri said, but I do think it's a very important point.
No, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for that. Comrade Mahal, before we wrap up in just a moment, do you want to give any closing comments?
I want to echo what Comrade Mzuri and our previous sister has just said. I think that solidarity comes about through curiosity. We have to be curious about each other, curious about what is happening. I got my political education through the All African People's Revolutionary Party, through Sister Mawin. I got all my books on Nkrumah, you know, those books that used to be printed underground in Texas. I got my books there. And so when I came home, I brought that curriculum home, and we adapted a lot of things that we use now for our political education here. So it's curiosity about each other, which I think is fundamental. But there's so many issues that can connect us. The issue of fees for university is universal amongst Africans everywhere in the world. This is something that our student movement and students there can link up with. AAPRP was very strong in universities when I was in university. I first met Comrade Kwame Toure at my university, where he was speaking in the 70s. So I think that we have to be look at health. Why is it that African people do not have medical insurance? Can we draw up campaigns around that. Migration is a huge issue for us here on the African continent. It's culminating with many of our youth going off to Europe. Why? Why we need to have those conversations. Drugs is huge. We have a huge problem with drugs in our high schools and primary schools in this country, with drug dealers standing outside selling drugs to 9-year-olds, 8-year-olds. So these are common issues that we have together. So I'm just saying that these are the everyday bread and butter issues that we need to have curiosity and learn from each other, exchange ideas, hold campaigns together, have sister cities together, and as Comrade Mzuri was saying, we had these tours that came through the US. A lot of the stuff that we used to do is more relevant than ever today, in fact. So we need to connect and connect in a real way. I have no problems with Zoom. It's but one tool. But connecting and campaigning together in the same spaces, it would be so fantastic when we receive people here from the All African People's Revolutionary Union. I'm telling you, everybody wants to come and sit and listen and hear the experiences of these brothers. Comrade Bob Brown was here helping us run our local government elections, telling us, you need data, you need this. We were just running elections, but he brought that experience there. So I think that we have to be curious about each other again, and we have to develop love for each other, real love for each other, love working together, love being together. I love being with my sister, Comrade Mzuri, and conversing, gossiping, chatting and talking about things that really confront us as Pan-Africanist women in our movements. These are important things, important times, and they build very strong ties, and we learn from each other. So let's work on coming together in a common space. Let's work on coming together around a common campaign that can once again make women, Pan-Africanist women, visible. I think this is important. Is relate.
Africa.
Thank you. And I want to just express my gratitude to this amazing panel. Once again, I don't know if you all can see the audience responses, but there's hearts and applause and, all sorts of expressions of gratitude and love to you all. So much appreciation. So we are going to transition to the last segment of our program. And I want to introduce our comrade, Abena Disraeli-Morris. And let me give you a bit of information about our comrade before I bring her on. Abena Disraeli-Morris has been called a poet for the people, a spiritual healer poet, and finally being given the title High Priestess of Poetry by the Washington, D.C. community. She was finally given that title recently. She is the embodiment and definition of community empowerment, organizational leadership, creativity, compassion, while using her art and poetry as therapy for cancer patients at Howard University. Abena has become a treasured and accomplished cultural ambassador, organizer, and spiritual leader with the gift of being able to bring diverse people together to work and collaborate successfully. Her work extends internationally as she just returned from Venezuela and as an invited delegate and cultural ambassador. That was her purpose for her visit there. She's even performed 3 times during her stay in Venezuela and was interviewed with leading community activists. So without further ado, I want to bring forward Comrade Abena.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Comrade.
Greetings, comrades. I'll just share a little bit of poetry here with you. It's a pleasure to be here, and the program is fantastic. Societal ills. The indigenous side of this place has been erased. So many have died. The elders' wisdom no longer guides this society. A monster grows, feeding off of instant gratification, ignoring the need, always hungry for the want. The appetite grows like Pinocchio's nose, manipulating its way with lies. This monster grows stronger and stronger every day, destroying and consuming everything in its path. You do the math. Our society is mentally and physically dying. Time out for trying. Where are the chosen few that will stand up and do the do, accepting the responsibility for what needs to be done? To evoke and awaken and change, it's a brain game that is driving many insane. Right is now wrong, and wrong is now right, and the truth is nowhere in sight. So I exercise with my might, my overstanding tight, to survive the night. I must make it to the morning light. So many shape-shifting around me, I step myself so the negative cannot find me. But my mind conceives, mouth gives birth to the truth that is 777 proof. I seek to a higher place. So I take to a mountaintop where I can gaze at what is going on in society, a clear look in my place, where my voice carries the loudest. At the sight of what I see, it moves me deeply, creating high emotions, manifesting tears of blood. My eyes create a flood that drips from my face onto my white clothes. Soar like the ugly in the world, I need to see more. My wings are dry, so I fly high. A high priestess has emerged. There is one who sees me, and his eyes burn red, and he glides from place to place like he's connected to a thread. This X-ray entity followed me and cornered me and engaged me in a brief fight to see what I was made of. In the melee, he cut me and I bled, and in the sight of it all, I fled. Why? I do not understand until I became silent. For my blood began to cry out. It was ancestral voices I was hearing, echoing in my mind, echoing in my head, influencing my thoughts, spirituality navigating me to a place not yet known. Traveling a path after a mental war aftermath, physically afflicted, spiritually discombobulated, my spirit is overlaid. And once again, I'm on. You see, there's transformations taking time to shape our minds of all life vibrations that flow throughout the universe. Behold the coming of our ancestors. Look at them, surrounding us, sitting and talking and deciding who will walk beside us on this particular journey. I hear them beckoning the spirits of Shango, Oshun, Obatala, Ogun, Yemeyak, Clemencine, Clamel, Ursuli, Dantor, Ursuli, Freda, calling all the way from Haiti. Come, come. Our daughter has called you. Come and strengthen her and instruct her on how to walk this journey, destined for greatness. The hurts, the disappointments, the disrespect, the abuse, the rapes, the betrayal, the deaths, the births. How did she survive? How did she become stronger than ever in her convictions to listen? To just listen to the nature's winds, the rain, the fire, the thunder, and the lightning, feeling the energy, connecting questions to wisdom and wisdom to questions. Behold, a high priestess has emerged for the people, for the people, for the people. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. That was beautiful, Comrade Abena. Thank you so much. And what an excellent way to conclude our program. And so, of course, I want to end with saying, if you are not a part of an organization, please join an organization fighting for liberation and justice. I want to also encourage you to help build with and help build up the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union. If you want to learn more about the AAPRP, you can visit the website, or you can visit AAP, oops, I got closed out there, my bad. Let me come back in. Sorry about that. My screen closed on me. But you could visit aapRP.intl.org. I think these links are in the chat. Also, I want to provide the Patreon for the Thomas Sankara Center, which we want to continue to support the important and fundamental and revolutionary work that they're doing at that center. Is really amazing. And we need to support these organizations to keep them strong and keep them moving. And so you can support on Patreon at Burkina Books, Burkina Books, okay? There's also an Etsy shop where you could buy merch, through the AAPRP. So do that if you're interested as well. Thank you all so much for joining us. This has been incredible. Forward ever, backwards never, a luta continua. Take care, everyone.
Backward never.
Forward